All right, good afternoon. This is the lecture video for Unit 8 for Econ 151. So before we begin, let me explain how Unit 8 and Unit 9 work. So Unit 8 and Unit 9 are about money, monetary system, and monetary policies. And there are actually 3 chapters for these 2 units. And I cannot split 3 chapters into 2 for homework and quizzes and etc. So since Unit 8 is right after your second exam, I only put chapter 13 for Unit 8 and then 14, 15 in Unit 9. However, to make sure in class our time is more evenly distributed, Unit 8, I'm going to talk about Chapter 13 and then get into 14 a little bit. So, homework and quizzes wise, you only need to worry about Chapter 13 for Unit 8, but know that we will get into 14 a little bit. So if you have time, go ahead and read the first third to half of 14 for the purpose of this unit. Okay. All right. So Unit 8 or Chapter 13 is about money. Okay. For some of you, it might be finally a yes, right? Because I know a lot of times people think economics is about money, right? And that is not the case. Hopefully you have learned by now. But nonetheless, we do talk about money, and it is part of economics. So we can figure out, okay, how to talk about money. Okay. Now, first of all, okay, we might want to talk about the evolution of money. Where did money come from, right? So this is again, I'm trying to follow the discussion roughly, and I'm not going to go into detail with everything because you can read some things fairly easily. But I do want to talk about how money came along in our societies. Okay, before money was available, we had what's called bartering. Okay, so excuse me. Okay, bartering is a different way of making transactions happen. Right? Bartering refers to you exchange one thing for another thing directly with no money involved. Excuse me. And now, that might not seem that big of a deal now, but before money came along, there was no internet, right? No internet meant very difficult to find information out there, and bartering required what's called the double coincidence of wants. Okay, so what that means is, let's say if I have an extra bed and I need a pig, then I have to find somebody who has an extra pig and wants my extra bed to make the transaction happen. Okay, and without the internet, it's very difficult to actually find somebody that has this complementing double coincidence of wants with you. So as a result, very few transactions happened, and the economic activity was extremely low in the early human societies until one day, right? Somebody came along and thought about this long and hard and figured out how to solve it, right? So let's say that, let's say that Faith has an extra wheel, okay? And she wants to have a sheep, but she could not find anybody that had an extra sheep and wanted her wheel, okay? In the meantime, she knows that, Gonzalo has a sheep that she can use, but unfortunately, Gonzalo doesn't want her extra wheel, right? She knows that Gonzalo wants my extra bed, okay? So in the meantime, okay, Faith realized that she has this beautiful big round rock right outside of her cave that Gonzalo has just been eyeing, right? Every time Gonzalo walks by, and he just looks at that rock and just gets mesmerized and compliments on how beautiful that rock is. Okay, and so Faith comes up with this plan, and she approaches Gonzalo, said, "Hey, Gonzalo, you know, I know you have an extra sheep. I would really like to have it, but in the same time, I know you don't want an extra wheel that I have. So tell you what, okay, if you let me have that sheep, okay, you can have that big rock in front of my cave. I mean, it might be too big for you to move, but I'll put a sign right next to it that says Gonzalo's Rock. And also, I know that you want, Brother Ma's extra bed, and you don't have anything to offer him. And I've caught him eyeing that rock a couple times too. So I guarantee you, if you want that bed really badly, and you offer him that rock, he's going to do it. Gonzalo thinks about it and realizes, you know what, that is a beautiful rock, right? I have been very impressed with that rock, and I think Brother Ma will like it too. So either I get a rock I really like, or I can get a bed I really need. So either way, this is a good deal. So Gonzalo agrees to it and takes the rock and gives Faith her sheep. Okay, and then that is the birth of money. All of a sudden, we have money. Okay, because that rock serves as this medium that allowed this transaction to happen. Okay, so that is when we move from bartering to using money for transactions. Okay, now the different forms of money, there are three types. Okay, the first type of money is called a commodity money. Okay, a commodity money is something that has intrinsic value itself that is being used as money. Okay, so for example, that rock we just talked about, and we have also used shells, even grains, and eventually we moved on to precious metals like gold and silver and copper. Right, so these things have value in themselves, and then they also serve as money. So those are called commodity money. Now, the pros and cons of this, okay, is, well, commodity money, first of all, the pro definitely is allowed us to make more transactions happen, right? You don't need to have the double coincidence of wants anymore. So economic activities picked up, then people were able to develop and prosper more than under bartering, okay? And also that since it has intrinsic value, then you don't have to worry about the value changing too much. And if let's say if we use grain for money, and if you somehow don't need to spend it right away, and before it goes bad, you can always eat it, right? So it serves more than just money because it has value in itself. And the cons uh, can be many as well, right? First of all, commodity money might not have a uniform quality, right? Because you probably want to spend the gold with a lot of junk mixed in it and want to keep the pure gold to yourself. So the quality money circulating can vary and decrease over time. And also, a big problem with this is that commodity money is kind of hard to transport, right? If you have a large purchase, then hauling a big quantity of gold over the distance you have to travel might be very dangerous, right? So there's some problems and definitely pros, but also cons. So now let's talk about how then we moved on from commodity money, right? So let's say that Will lives in Rexburg, Idaho, and he owns a general store called Walmart, right? And everybody shops there, okay? But Will mostly gets his supplies from Ogden, Utah, right? And now Will, after feeding everybody through the pandemic period, he's running low on his supplies, so he needs to go to Ogden to restock. Okay, the problem is he needs to make a big purchase so that his payment that he needs to take to Ogden is going to be huge, right? And let's say currently we use gold as the money for transactions, and Will has heard stories about these bandits living around the hills of Pocatello, which is a must, and he must go through that town on the way down to Ogden. So if that's the case, okay, Will might be very concerned of being robbed because these bandits have been known to ruthlessly rob everybody, right? So maybe, Will thinks about this long and hard and trying to figure out how to do this. And he realized, you know what? Okay, uh, Daniel is known for being honest and tough, right? And he's trustworthy and he's tough. So Will comes up with his plan and he approaches Daniel and said, hey, Daniel, I need to make a huge purchase, right? And 50 pounds of gold's worth of purchase, actually. But I worry about being robbed along my way and carrying this, really heavy burden for hundreds of miles and over mountains and such. So how about this? Okay, you are a well-known, trustworthy, and strong person, right? So what if I leave my 50 pounds of gold with you and you write a personal note, add some kind of feature that the recipient will know is authenticated and it is from you, then I can take it down to my supplier Cheyenne in Ogden, and you know, once she realizes that it's yours and she can trust you that you have my gold, and then she'll probably just sell me the goods with that piece of paper with your signature or your personal creed on it. Okay, and then if she brings when she brings that piece of paper to you, you can let her claim my gold. Okay, and I'll pay you 2%. How about that? Right? And Daniel thinks about that and says, you know what? Yeah, sure. I just right now I feel like I should stay home anyway, and the pandemic is not all over, right? I got a basement closet I'm not using, so I got 50 guns sitting around because I live in Idaho, and sure, I'll do that. Okay, so Daniel makes this some kind of certificate or proof that, hey, Will has 50 pounds of gold with me, and I will guard it with my life, and whoever holds this note will be able to come and claim it. So then Will can just take this piece of paper and easily conceal it and travels down to Ogden and goes to Cheyenne, say, hey, I'm here to make a big purchase. I don't have the gold with me, but here is the proof that I'm good for 50 pounds of gold, and we both know Daniel. You know he's trustworthy and he's strong and he can guard this gold. And when you bring this to him, he will give you the gold whenever you want. Okay. And Cheyenne knows Daniel's reputation, and she examines that carefully. Said, "Yep, that's the secret mark that I know Daniel makes, and nobody else can copy. Right? So this is authentic. Sure, I'll do the deal with you. Right? So once this transaction happens, then we have moved on from commodity money to token money, and sometimes referred to as paper money. Okay, so as you can see, token money or paper money, okay, is a type of money that is backed up by something with intrinsic value, right? The piece of paper by itself might not have value, but it does get backed up by something with value. So that piece of paper is not worth anything, but you can exchange it for gold, so that gives it value. So that's the next step in the evolution of money, and now there are definitely pros and cons with this as well, right? The pros are definitely this is a lot easier to transport, and you can have large quantities and conceal that very easily without having to worry about being targeted. But and which allows transaction to happen more easily, right? But there are some problems. One is that maybe, right? Well, let's say that Josh looks at this situation and says, "Hey, I don't have gold, but I know Daniel's secret mark, and I can actually copy it pretty darn well. I took some art classes in high school, and I can use those skills to my gain, right? So Josh makes some fake certificates supposedly issued by Daniel, and people can't tell the difference. So Josh goes on a shopping spree, and then when people come to claim their gold, and that's when Daniel realizes that somebody has been counterfeiting his paper money, right? So that's one problem, right? And paper money can be counterfeited fairly easily, and also money can, if you happen to forget to take it out of your pocket and you do a wash and then do a drying cycle, then that can be destroyed, so it doesn't last very long. Okay, um, so these are some of the problems. But also another problem is, you know, I guess one big problem I forgot to talk about with commodity money is, especially with precious metal, there's a fairly limited amount of it available. So as our economy grows and our economic activity picks up, excuse me, and we won't have enough precious metal to support the level of transactions needed, right? We can't keep mining new gold to keep up with the economic growth. So with token money, since it is backed up by things of value like precious metal, we have not solved that problem, right? Because if every piece of paper that Daniel issues has to be backed up by some gold, then there's a limited amount of gold, so that means there's a limited amount of paper money we can issue. So we still can't satisfy all the growth in our economic activity, okay? And then finally, okay, we move on to our newest form of money, which is called fiat money, okay, where we no longer, so fiat money no longer is backed up by anything, okay, except people's faith. So where we realize, hey, we just don't have enough gold for this to work. So how about we form some kind of bank, and everybody agrees that this bank is important to us and is trustworthy, and then we allow this bank to print money that we all accept, right? So that's the fiat money that we now use. And in fact, we don't even need bills anymore. We don't need actual paper anymore, right? So the actual paper really is not worth anything. I forgot to bring my wallet downstairs with me, but you know, a $100 bill costs about 12 cents to make in the special ink and paper and printing, etc. So its actual value is just about 12 cents. But we all accept it as $100, so that's where its value comes from. And like I said, we don't even need the actual paper anymore. Right now, you work for a couple weeks and then you see digits show up on your screen and you get happy, right? In fact, there's no actual money going into your account at all, just some you know, pixels on your screen. That makes you super happy, right? So fiat money solves the problem of having a limited supply. Now that it doesn't have to be backed up by anything, we can just create as much money as we need to support our economic activities. Okay, so of course the biggest con you can see easily is that, well, this requires everybody's faith in this money. If somehow people stop having faith in the value of fiat money, then the value will collapse very quickly, right? But nonetheless, okay, these are the three types of money and how they came along and their pros and cons, okay? Now, the next question asks you about the three primary functions of money, okay? So when it comes to the definition of money in economics, okay, we look at whether something serves three functions or not. If it does, it's money. If not, it's not money, okay? So money is defined by these three functions, and it doesn't have anything to do who issues it, right? So just because a government prints it does not necessarily mean it is money, and vice versa, right? Just because it's some, you know, gangster that uses something else in their organization does not make that particular thing not money, right? So the three functions of money, the first one is called medium of exchange. Okay, so that means you can spend money and make transactions happen, right? You can give people money and they will give you a pair of shoes. So medium of exchange. Okay, the second one is the unit of account. Okay, what this means is that money helps you compare values across different products, right? Without money, it's very difficult to measure value, right? Without money, if I were to ask you, well, you know, what's the relative value between your computer and your shoes? You're going to have a hard time describing that to me, right? With money, you can say, well, the computer cost me $500 and shoes cost me $50, so the computer is 10 times as valuable, and that's very easy to understand. So money gives you unit of account, okay? And then the third one is that money gives you store of value. What that means is that over time, money will hold its value fairly well, okay? So for example, if you find a pair of shorts you haven't worn since last summer, you bring them out and then you put them on and you put your hand in your pocket, you happen to pull out a $20 bill you left last summer. You're not going to look at that and say, oh man, this expired in January, right? And then you throw it away. You're still going to be very happy and very thrilled to have that extra $20 you didn't know you had, right? So that's because money stores its value over time. Now, when something satisfies all three of these functions, it is money. Doesn't matter who issued it, and as long as it can allow it can allow exchange to happen, it can allow you to record value with different things, and it can store value fairly well, then it is money, right? For example, in a lot of prisons, cigarettes satisfy all three of these functions, so it is money, right? It is used as money, or even those ramen noodle seasoning packs, right? Those can serve all three purposes. That's money, okay? So it doesn't have to be issued by the government somehow. And in economics, we use these three functions to define money. Now, a common question I get usually by this point is somebody asks me, well, what about Bitcoin? Is that money? Okay, so Bitcoin or other kind of cryptocurrency is not money yet because it does not satisfy number three very well. Okay, its value fluctuates too much. For example, a couple years ago or a little over a year ago, right, Bitcoin was as high as $14,000, $17,000 each. Then it dropped down to below 4,000, and recently it bounced back to 10,000 again. So within 1 year, it's kind of like a roller coaster, and so its value is not stable. And because of that, it behaves more like a financial asset, such as a stock, than money itself, right? So it satisfies medium of exchange and unit of account, but it does not satisfy the store of value very well. So that's why it is not considered as money by most economists. It's still more like a financial asset you can put your money in. Now, if one day, because Facebook issued their, own digital currency called Libra, right? And many other governments and big companies are all investigating the possibility of issuing cryptocurrency. And maybe one day, that type of currency will become money. But for now, it's not quite there yet. Okay. All right. Okay, the next question we want to talk about is the fractional banking system, okay, and what the pros and cons of this system, okay. So the fractional banking system refers to the fact that when you put your money in the banks, okay, they only keep a small fraction of it, and then they loan the rest of it out to people who need to borrow money. For example, in the US, the minimum required of what banks have to hold out of your checking accounts is 10%. Okay, so if you put $1,000 in the bank is only required by law to hold $100 out of that. The other 900 can be loaned out. Okay, the minimum that banks need to hold for savings account is 0. Okay, so on average, only 8% of people's deposits are held as cash within banks. So 92% are loaned out. If you have $1,000 saved in the banks from both your checking and savings account, only $80 is there. $920 are loaned out. It's not there. Okay, so that's called the fractional banking system. Now, the pros and cons of this. Okay, people usually see the con pretty easily. If you were not aware of this, maybe this got you nervous and thinking, well, how can I get my money back, right? Now the answer is, if you are just individually asking for your money back, the bank can probably give you all your money back, because as long as not more than 8% of their customers come and ask for their money back, they have enough cash to satisfy that demand. But when more than a small percentage of their customers come and demand all their money back in cash, the banks can get into big trouble. Okay, in fact, oftentimes when people worry about their money, they can all rush to the bank and trying to pull it out at the same time, and then banks cannot satisfy that demand, and banks can fail, and that's called a bank run. Okay, so that's definitely the biggest con, where 92% of your money is gone, so you can't uh, all get your money back at the same time. But the biggest pro is that this allows people to make purchases that they otherwise cannot afford, or businesses to invest in their production that they otherwise cannot afford, right? So for example, with large ticket items like a house, this house cost me a lot of money to build, and if I were to save up that much money, I pretty much will not move in until I'm about to retire, right? So it would take me decades to save up enough cash to buy a house with cash. However, by borrowing, money from the bank, I'm able to make the purchase now and then just slowly pay back. Now, the way that banks make money is that they take your money, right, loan it out to me, and charge me. I currently my mortgage rate is, let's say, 3.375%, right, and then for your savings account, they pay you 0.1%, right, or maybe 0.2%. So the difference of 3.2 something percent is kept by the bank as their profit. So that's how banks make money, right? Through the fractional banking system of keeping just a small portion of your money, loaning it out, charging the borrowers a high interest rate, then pay you very low or no interest. So the difference is what the banks get to keep. Okay, so there are pros and there are cons, but that's the system we have in the United States. Okay, now in the U.S. we have different types of financial institutions. Okay, the first kind of financial institution is called depository. Okay, institutions. So these are usually like commercial banks where you can go deposit some money and have an account, right? So the second type is what we call thrift institutions. Okay, thrift institutions are things like thrift banks or credit unions. Okay, where you can also open accounts with them, but they function a little bit differently, right? So just in case you don't know the difference between a bank and a credit union, okay, these are the most common examples and of how these types of financial institutions are different. Okay, for a bank, you're a customer. Okay, for a credit union, you are a member, which means you're a partial owner. Okay, so the banks, when you deposit money and use their services, you're just a customer. Their loyalty lies with their stockholders who own the bank. You don't own the bank. But for credit unions, to use their services, you have to become a member, which means you become a partial owner. You pay a membership fee, and then you become partial owner. So that's why, generally speaking, credit unions can offer you better rates, either on the saving side or on the borrowing side, because part of their profit is distributed among all members, and that means you get a small cut of that profit. So that means they can pay you a little bit more on the savings account rate, or when you borrow from them, they can give you a little bit better, lower interest rate. So that's the difference. Okay. The third kind is investment banks. Okay, investment banks are different than commercial banks, such as the depository institutions, because you cannot go deposit your money and open an account with an investment bank. An investment bank usually manages large sum of wealth for other companies or extremely wealthy individuals. Okay, so these are banks that play with at least tens or hundreds of millions of dollars or more. they're not interested in your $1,200 of tax cut you got from the government, right? So their services include either directly managing wealth for corporations or wealthy individuals, right? For example, Goldman Sachs could very well have an account for GM where GM has, maybe $500 million or even $50 billion with Goldman Sachs, where Goldman Sachs manages this for them and makes sure this grows and continues to be invested well and bring high returns, right? Or if GM does not trust Goldman Sachs to directly manage their wealth, what another service investment banks like Goldman Sachs provides is that they will publish their recommendations on how to invest your money, and then GM can pay a fee to subscribe to that, right? So that's how investment banks function. So they are the bank of banks, if you will, and they don't deal with deposits, but they can manage large quantity of wealth for other banks or companies or extremely wealthy individuals. Okay, all right. Okay, now the Federal Reserve System is kind of interesting, right? So the Federal Reserve, you can read more about its history, but we got rid of it, we created again, we got rid of it, and then finally in 1913 we said, okay, let's just create it and hold on to it. So the Federal Reserve System is the central bank for the United States of America, right? Most countries in the world have their own central banks. A central bank is not a commercial bank, it's not an investment bank, but it's a regulator, government agency or quasi-government agency that regulates the banking industry. Okay, and so they don't take deposits, but they regulate how the banking system works. So the Federal Reserve System is our central bank in America. Now, we created it to serve a couple of main purposes. One is that its job is to regulate the banking system. Two is to one of its charges is to stabilize price level. Okay, so they have to make sure there's no hard inflation or deflation going on. And then they're supposed to promote employment. So their job is to make sure the economy continues to prosper. So these are some big charges, right, for the Federal Reserve System to achieve. Now, they have done a decent job, even though some people are critics of the Federal Reserve System. But whether you agree with this system or not, let's look at how it's set up. Okay, so at the very top of the Federal Reserve System, it's called a system because it is truly a system, you have an organization called the Board of Governors. Okay, there are 7 governors sitting on this board, so 7 members belong to this board. Okay, now each of these 7 governors is appointed by the president and approved by the Senate to serve staggered 14-year terms. Okay, so staggered 14-year terms. Staggered means every 2 years, a governor will step down. The president will get a chance to appoint a new one. Okay, and so every 2 years we have one position open up. Now they are they serve 14 years by design because these are the most powerful people that control the monetary system of the most important, the most important economy in the world, right? So, so we don't want them to cave into political influences. Okay, so once they are put in, they serve for 14 years, which, as you can tell, is 3.5 presidential terms. So they don't have to listen to any president or cave to any political pressure. They are supposed to be doing what is best for the economy, and so it's crucial for the central bank to remain politically neutral, and we've done a fairly good job with that. Okay. Now, certainly, each president will have their mark on appointing to 4 of these governors, but they will never have the complete control of the board. Right. Now, out of these 7 members, 1 is appointed by the president to be the chair of the Federal Reserve System. Okay, so the chairship is a 4-year appointment. Currently, the Federal Reserve Chair, his name is Jerome Powell, and Trump appointed him, and it was quite a controversy because Jerome Powell is the second federal chair ever that does not hold a PhD in economics. Right, so when he was appointed, that was quite a controversy because we're handing the reign of the whole economy to somebody who supposedly doesn't really know much about economics. So Powell was a Wall Street guy that became a personal friend with Trump. Now, I have to say, I have been surprised that after he went in, he has not just followed Trump and done everything Trump wanted him to do, and I think he's made some good decisions. I was pleasantly surprised. Okay, now, so after 4 years being the chair, then whether they get to serve as chair again or not is up to the president. If the president does not reappoint them, then they can remain on the board for another 10 years just as a member. But of course, most will take that as a hint and they actually resign, so the president will get to choose somebody brand new. But anyway, so that's how the Board of Governors works. So 7 members serving staggered 14-year terms, and 1 of them will be appointed as the chair, which is the most powerful person in economic manipulation throughout the whole world, right? And the chairship is a 4-year appointment. Now, under the Board of Governors, you have another committee called the Federal Open Market Committee. Okay, or FOMC for short. Okay, so the FOMC has 12 members. Okay, and all 7 governors sit on the FOMC. So 7 out of the 12 members are the governors, and they will always maintain a majority vote on this committee. And that is extremely important because the FOMC is the entity that decides all the monetary policy changes in our economy. Right? So you can see by maintaining the majority vote on the FOMC, the governors will always have direct control of direct control of monetary policies. So nothing will get out of hand without their approval. Now, the other 5 members come from the 12 member banks, okay, that sit under the Board of Governors and FOMC. So there are 12 member banks, and each bank has a president, and 5 of these presidents make up the other 5 members on the FOMC. Now, one of them is special. Okay, the New York Fed's president is a sitting member of the FOMC because the New York Fed serves 2 functions that no other member banks in the Federal Reserve System can touch. Okay, one is that the New York Fed is the one that implements all the monetary policies that the FOMC decides. No other banks will implement those policies. And 2 is that the New York Fed is the only bank authorized to perform foreign exchange operations for the Federal Reserve System. So no other member banks can play with foreign exchange and foreign currencies, but the New York Fed can. So because of that, and plus New York is the financial center of the country, so the president of the New York Fed is a sitting member on the FOMC committee. Then that leaves us four, right? Seven are the governors and one is the New York Fed. So 8 seats are taken. So the other 4 seats on the FOMC come from the other 11 member bank presidents. So 4 of them will serve on a 1-year rotating basis. So every year a new 4 will serve on that FOMC. Now all of them will participate in the policy discussions, but only these 12 people get to vote on if they make a change or not. Now the Federal Reserve is the entity that's in charge of the monetary policies for the country. So they actually keep a very close tab on what's going on, and they meet every 6 weeks to discuss if there's a need to make a change. So that is pretty frequent in terms of how to manage a country, right? And in fact, every July, their meeting always happens in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. I don't know if they're coming this year, but they usually come, and I think that's when all the super wealthy and powerful people come to Jackson Hole, Wyoming. But they always hold a meeting here and make some big decisions about the world economy, and then go hiking or something. But anyway, so now these 12 member banks each takes a geographical area of the country, and then they manage the economy, okay, they manage the banking system in that region. So let me show you a map, okay. Okay, so let me share my screen. All right, here. Okay, hope you guys can see this. Okay, all right. So this is the map of how these 12 different member banks divvy up the country, right? Looks like the Hunger Games, right? So we're from District 12. Now, something interesting about this is that now there's probably to you guys a really old movie called Catch Me If You Can, and if you're not familiar about it, it's a movie starring Tom Hanks and Leonardo DiCaprio. I can't remember if I'm saying his last name right, but anyway, you know who I'm talking about. Anyway, so this movie is based on a real story happened in the 1960s. In the 1960s, a bunch of forged checks were cashed all around the country, millions and millions of dollars. And the FBI was involved, and they just could not crack this case. They could not figure out who's doing these checks, because these checks were faked to a very high quality, and most banks couldn't tell the difference. And the only way they were caught is because one of the main functions till this day for the Federal Reserve banks is to clear checks. So every check you write is cleared by one of the 12 Federal Reserve banks, usually by the one where the check is originated. So when you open a bank account, that account number or the routing number, okay, for that bank tells you which district they're in, right? So I opened my very first bank account with Zions Bank many years ago, and it's in Utah. So the routing number for Zions Bank is 120000054. So that tells you it's a bank in District 12, right? But anyway, so turns out what was happening in the 1960s was that it was not this experienced, sophisticated, seasoned criminal doing this. It was a 16-year-old kid who somehow just had a talent at making fake checks. And then what he was doing was also he he forged IDs as an airline pilot, and airlines fly each other's pilots to different destinations for them to, start their route all the time. So he would hitch a free flight pretending to be a pilot and fly all over the country and cash checks that he faked from a different region. So for example, he would fly to New York City, okay, right over here in District 2, and forge a check that was supposedly originated from San Francisco, and he would cash it. And then, okay, by the time the bank that cashed that check, back then there was no internet, so they would have to mail this check all the way to San Francisco for clearing. And by the time the San Francisco Fed realizes this is a fake check and calls that bank in New York or sends a telegraph to New York, that kid is long gone. He would have already gone maybe to Chicago and cashed a check from, originated from Dallas. And then, so he was bouncing all around the country, cashing these fake checks that originated in a different district and playing that time difference, and successfully got away with millions and millions of dollars in in damage to the banks. So that movie is about how this FBI agent in charge and this criminal play this cat and mouse game. Eventually, he was caught, and then later he actually became a consultant for the FBI, and he's responsible for almost all the security features on checks that we have nowadays. Right, nowadays checks are a lot harder to fake because this guy actually used his knowledge later on for good. But anyway, so I just thought that might be something interesting. Okay, so let me go back to my other screen that I was sharing. Okay, good. We're back. All right. So now that's the structure of the Federal Reserve System. Okay. Again, if you have questions, write them down, and we'll talk about them next Monday. No, sorry, the following Monday, not next Monday, right? So because right now it's still the 20th. So the Monday after next one. Okay. And now the next thing I want to briefly talk about is something called the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC for short, okay, and what it is and why we have it, okay. So we have already mentioned that because of the fractional banking system, banks are vulnerable to bank runs. When a lot of people come and demand their money back, banks will not be able to pay the money back to their customers, and then in that case they will fail. So this has happened repeatedly throughout history, and the worst was in the Great Depression in the 1920s and 1930s. Okay, and back then about 1/3 of all the banks in the country failed, mostly due to bank runs. And so after that, we were thinking about what to do, and the government said, or the Federal Reserve, and the federal government said, hey, let's create this insurance program where if banks participate in this and pay us a premium, we will insure their customers' money. So if the bank fails for some reason, the customers don't lose all their money. Okay, and it used to be they insured up to 10 accounts and per customer, up to 10 accounts per customer, and each account was insured up to $100,000. Now, in 2008, there was again panic, and in the whole country, I think over 800 banks failed in 2008, 2009 financial crisis. So during that time, to calm people's nerves, the FDIC increased their coverage to $250,000 per account, up to 10 accounts per customer. So you can have $2.5 million, spread over 10 accounts, and that will be covered by the FDIC as long as your bank is a member. of the FDIC, right? So this way you don't have to worry about, what if the bank fails and my money goes down with it. In fact, in 2009, I was teaching this concept to my students at Washington State University at the time, and one of the kids actually raised his hand and said, actually recently happened to me. My bank failed, and I got email from the FDIC about it. It's like, really, what did they do? Did they just refund you your balance? He's like, no, it was actually quite boring. They just sent me an email, said, your bank failed. We have transferred your balance to another bank, and here's your account number. So contact them to get the rest of the things set up, but your money's there now. So it's like, oh, okay, well, that was easier than I expected, right? They didn't have to actually pay money out. But nonetheless, right, now he didn't lose all his money. Not like, President Hinckley, if you read his biography, when he was 25, so back then, not all young men were required to serve missions because the mission was very expensive and the church wasn't that big to use all of the young men yet. And it was usually by invitation to serve a mission. So he was 25. His mother had just passed away from cancer, and he was about to graduate from University of Utah. And his bishop called him into the office and Gordon, I'd like you to go serve a mission. And President Hinckley said, he was shocked because he was, he was born in 1910, so when he was 25 it was 1935, and his bank had just recently failed, taking all of his savings with it, right? Back then there was no FDIC, so the money he saved for years as a young man was all gone. And so he was, telling his bishop, how am I going to serve a mission? I don't have any money left. My bank just failed. And so his bishop said, why don't you go home and talk to your father and decide? So he went home and talked to his dad. And his dad said, I don't know how, but let's move forward. And then right after that, his dad discovered while going through the belongings of his mother's, and they found that his mother had been putting away change from her grocery shopping trips, and she had saved them in the spot that his dad and the kids didn't know about. They found it, and it was just enough to send him on his mission. And so he talked about how a miracle that was, and the mother's love allowed him to serve, and his father encouraged him to serve when he didn't feel like it, and how that that mission changed his whole life, right? So, but anyway, so he lost all his money because there was no FDIC. Now, till this day, okay, only about, not only, but 97% of all the banks and credit unions have a very similar system called the Federal Deposit, like credit union insurance or something. But 97% of all the financial institutions, depository institutions in the country are members of these programs. Okay, but that means 2 or 3% aren't. So when you bank with somebody, make sure you see, usually they have a sign on their door or window says member of FDIC, or they'll have a little plaque on their counter says member FDIC. If you don't see that, make sure you ask them, are you a member of FDIC? And if they say no, you probably want to take your money somewhere else, because if they're not a member, if they don't participate in this insurance program and that bank fails, they can take your money with them, right? So, all right. Okay, now number 9 asks you about question number 9 on the discussion asks you about the Great Recession and how it affected the banking system. I'm going to save that for our lesson together, because that's, to me, an interesting story, right? And but be kind of lengthy and not as fun to talk about it in a video. So we'll save that one, okay? And then the next thing I want to talk about, okay, is so questions 10 and 11 come from chapter 14 about money supply and how banks create money. Okay, so let's talk about that really quick, and then we can wrap it up for the day. Okay, so money supply, first of all, is a measurement of all the money that we have in our economy. Okay, now there are two ways to measure money supply. Okay, very creatively named by economists, M1 and M2. Okay, you can tell economists to name that. So M1 includes the following. So, well, I guess first of all, M1 is the smaller and more liquid form of money supply. Okay, by liquid, in monetary terms, liquid means how easy it is to convert to cash. Okay, the more liquid something is, the more easily it is converted to cash. For example, your checking account, very liquid. You can take it out and change it into cash anytime you want. Okay, a house, very illiquid, right? It's hard to sell a house. It takes weeks, sometimes months to convert a house into cash. So that's what liquid means. Now, M1 is a smaller measurement of money supply and it's a more liquid measure. So these are things that are easily converted into cash. Okay, so first of all, M1 includes all the currency that we have made. So that includes all the bills and coins, okay? And this is all the currency held outside of banks. So that means any money in your wallet, shoe boxes, right, wherever you like to stash them, um, that is part of our money supply in the economy, right? And then also, okay, plus checking, okay, deposits. So, okay, so whatever checking account balances people have all added up together, okay, plus, okay, this is something you're not familiar with called traveler's checks, okay. So traveler's checks, you'll have to ask your grandparents about these. So these were very popular for people to use, especially when they were traveling, because now taking cash with you, especially when you travel, is not very safe, especially if you have a large amount. So people like to take checks, but the problem with regular checks is that they can bounce, so many places don't accept it. Now, a traveler's check is a cashier's check, a type of cashier's check. So that means you have to have the money first before the banks will issue these checks. So these checks will not bounce. If you have a traveler's check for $3,000, the bank already took $3,000 of your money and held it for this purpose. So traveler's checks will not bounce. So businesses worldwide will accept these, but also it's an added layer of security because you have to sign and endorse it before it can be converted to cash or spent. So people back before mobile pay and credit cards and etc. Liked traveler's checks a lot, and but since it's kind of like a cashier's check, it's very liquid. It's very easy to convert into cash. That's part of M1. Okay, now M2, okay, is the broader and less liquid form of money supply measurement. Okay, so M2 equals all of M1. Okay, so everything M1 is part of M2 plus, okay, money market mutual funds, okay, plus all of your savings deposits, plus, okay, certificates of deposits. Okay, so money market mutual funds, savings deposits, and certificate deposits are all types of accounts that banks offer people to hold their money, and these usually bear higher interest because these are accounts you put your money in and you don't usually touch for a while, so it's less liquid. Okay, so certificate of deposits, just CD accounts, you might have heard of those, right? So money market mutual funds, savings accounts, CD accounts, these are things that you put your money in, you don't touch for a long time, so it's less liquid, okay? But all those plus M1 make up your M2, okay? Now, these two, I mean, might seem boring, but actually they can be a little tricky, right? So for example, if you totally forgot you had $1,000 in your shoebox and you're moving, you pull it out, you open it up, you're like, oh, hey, I got $1,000, right? Uh, so, and then you decide instead of hauling with you in the U-Haul, you're going to just put it in the bank, and you take it to your bank and you put it in your bank. Now my question is, okay, how did that change M1 and M2, right? Well, so if you take $1,000 in cash, put it in your checking account, that means your currency decreases by $1,000, okay, and your checking deposit will increase by $1,000. So overall, no change to M1, okay, and if there's no change to M1, then there's no change to M2, okay. However, if I change this scenario a little bit, I say, well, you find $1,000 in cash in a shoebox, and you decided to put it into your savings account. How does that affect M1 and M2? Well, so first of all, in M1, you can see when you put it in your savings account, currency decreases by 1,000 right here, okay? But nothing else changes. So overall, when that happens, M1 actually decreases by $1,000. But for M2, okay, you put it in the savings account, so $1,000 more is in the savings account, but M1 decreases by $1,000. So M2 in this case doesn't change, right? So when you take $1,000 from your shoebox and put it in the savings account, then it actually decreases M1 by 1,000, but M2 remains the same. If you put it in the checking account, then neither will change. M1 and M2, neither will change, right? So there are some interesting scenarios you can kind of play with and figure out. Okay, so that's M1 and M2. Okay, now last thing I want to talk about is how banks create money. What I mean by that is if you look at the size of M1 and M2, okay, so all the money that we have created, all the bills we've printed and all the coins we've minted, added up together is called the monetary base, okay? That's how much actual money we've produced as a country. However, if you look at the size of M1, even the smaller measure of money supply, it's about 3 times as big as the monetary base. So if we have only printed $1 million, we somehow, if you look at M1, we have $3 million circulating in the economy. If you look at M2, sometimes it's as big as 14 times as big as the monetary base. So we have $14 million circulating in the economy. So the question is, well, where did this extra money come from if we didn't make it, right? So this is because banks, quote unquote, create money through their fractional banking system, okay? Now, let me give you an example of how this works, right? So in a nutshell, okay, so let me share my screen. Okay. Okay, so where's share screen and this one. Okay, now can you guys see my share screen, I hope? Okay, good. I can see it on my second account here. So money, okay, is created, okay, because of the fractional banking system. What I mean by that is, well, banks take your deposit, they keep a small proportion, then they roll over the rest into loans. And these loans will become new deposits, right? Because somebody will take these loans and spend it, and then they will come back as somebody else's money. And nobody takes out a loan just to sleep with it under the pillow and feel good about themselves, right? I hope not, anyway. Now, when the loans come back as new deposits for somebody else, then the bank will keep a portion of that and then loan the rest out, and then that will come back as a third person's deposits. And so every time it comes back, it gets recorded as somebody else's new deposits. Okay, so let me give you a quick, simple example with numbers, so hopefully you can see this. Right? Let's do some assumptions to make your life easy. Okay, first we assume there's a fixed required reserve ratio of 10%. That means the Federal Reserve requires all banks to hold 10% of all their deposits. Okay, So that's not far off from reality. We said, for checking accounts, our required reserve ratio is 10%. The only difference is in reality, savings is 0, but let's assume that's not the case. Everything is 10%, and we also assume banks want to hold no excess reserves, okay? So they only hold 10%, not 11, not 12, not 15, just 10%. The rest is all loaned out. They loan out 90%. Again, that is to make your life a little bit easy, okay? And the third is we assume there's a fixed amount of currency all circulating, so no new currency being printed, okay? And then finally, all deposits are demand deposits. So demand deposits are checking accounts. So no savings account, no money market mutual funds, no CD accounts, etc. Right? So just one type of account. Again, these assumptions just make your life easy, all right, and make this process easier to see and understand. In real life, it'll be a little bit different, but the principles are exactly the same. Okay. So now let's say that we're looking at a bank creatively named Bank A. Okay. Now I've been told by accounting students that the T table here, assets and liabilities are flipped. I apologize. I'm not an accountant, and in Econ, this is how we usually look at things. Okay. So you can see for Bank A, we have this table we call a T table, which compares Bank A's assets and liabilities. Assets are what Bank A owns. Liabilities are what Bank A owes. Okay. So you can see that they owe, okay, $1,000 in deposits because deposits are their customers' money. So they will have to pay that back. If a customer comes and demand their money back, the bank will have to give it back. So that's their liability, okay? But in terms of cash, out of the $1,000, they hold on to 10% in cash, or sorry, they hold on to $100, which is 10% of the deposits in cash. That's required by law. But we said they don't hold anything more than required, so they loan the other $900 out. Now the $900 loans are assets because that's what people owe the bank, right? So this is what the bank can claim, so that's why it falls under assets. Well, so overall you can see that Bank A has $1,000 of assets, $1,000 of liabilities, no problem here. And reserve ratio is the amount of cash they hold of $100 divided by the total amount of deposits of 1,000, which is 10%. Okay, so everything's good. Now, okay, let's say that I don't know. Let's see. Daisy, deposits $100 she just made from babysitting, right? Maybe she's got a weekend gig and babysat for somebody. They paid her $100, and she goes to Bank A, puts it into her bank account. Okay. Now, the moment she puts it into her bank account at Bank A, the amount of deposits increased to 1,100, right? But also cash increases to 200 because Daisy dropped off $100 in cash there. Okay, so loans is still 900, no change there, and the total amount of assets is 1,100, so still balanced. But the problem is right here. The reserve ratio now is 200 of cash divided by 1,100 of total deposits, and that's 18.2% held in reserves. And that's apparently too high for this bank. We assume that this bank, Bank A, only holds 10%, right? So that means the bank will have to get rid of the extra 8.2% of deposits and make it into loans. So they make into a new loan of $90, okay? So let's say that, Josh takes the $90 of loan out because he needs a new calculator for his calculus class next year. So he takes a $90 loan and he goes to the local electronics store, spends it, and buys a new calculator. The electronics store owner will get the $90 of the loan that Josh took out, and then let's say this, actually, let's stop right here. So once Josh takes the loan out, then let's look at what happens to Bank A, right? Deposit is still 1,100. Now cash is down to 110. Loan amount goes to 990. So overall, okay, the reserve ratio is $110 of cash divided by $1,100 deposits goes back to 10%. So we're good. Okay. Now, let's say Josh spends $90 and then the electronic store owner gets it, and then he puts it into his bank account, right? Because we said we assume nobody holds on to cash, everything is put into the banks. Now it can be any bank, but for our convenience, let's say that electronic store owner also uses Bank A. Okay, so when he makes that $90 deposit as his money into Bank A, let's look at what happens. Okay, now the total amount of deposits increased to $11.90 because the $90 now came back as the store owner's new deposit. And that also, $90 cash made the total amount of cash go from 110 up to 200 again. Okay, loan is still at 990, so liabilities and assets are still balanced, but the problem again is the reserve ratio is $200 in cash divided by 1190 of total deposits, which is 16.8%. You again have an excess of 6.8% of reserves that the Bank A doesn't want to hold. Okay, so well, that means Bank A needs to get rid of the 6.8% to lower it down to the 10% they like and required by law. So that means they need to, okay, reduce their cash reserve down to 119, right? 10% of 1190 of total deposits, and that means they need to make a new loan of $81. Okay, now let's say that Isaac gets the $81 and he took out an $81 loan, and he's using the $81 to buy his father a nice Father's Day present. Maybe it's his father's baseball glove, signed by his father's favorite baseball player, right? So whatever it is, okay, Isaac takes out this loan, okay, then he spends it, and then the sporting goods store owner, right, got it, and she deposits back into the bank as her new money. Okay, now this will create a new deposit of $81, and then that will mean the bank will have too much cash on hand, and they will have to loan out some more. So this process repeats itself. Now remember, all this started with Daisy depositing her $100 babysitting money, and then that triggered this new rounds of new deposits coming back, has loaned out, spent somebody else's money coming in as somebody else's money. And part of it is loaned out and it gets spent and then becomes somebody else's money. So every time it comes back, it adds on to the total amount of money the bank is holding, total amount of deposits the money the bank is holding. And this process will keep going. That's how the bank, quote unquote, create money. The same $100 will keep coming back as new deposits until it becomes too small to circulate. So now, yeah, so the initial new deposit was 90, then it was loaned out, came back as, the initial new deposit was 100, then it was loaned out, it came back as a new deposit of 90, then that was loaned out and came back as a new deposit of 81, okay? Hopefully you can see the pattern here, right? So the pattern is that it's 90% of the previous round's amount every time. Now, you probably don't recall this from your algebra days, but when you have this kind of pattern, you can actually easily calculate the total amount that this initial $100 will add up to by the end it dies off from circulating. Okay, and that is what we call a money multiplier. A money multiplier measures how much money supply will increase from your initial deposit. Okay, so it's a similar idea as the spending multiplier. The spending multiplier tells you how much your GDP, real GDP, will increase from your initial spending. But here, money multiplier tells you how much money supply will increase with your initial deposit. Okay, so this pattern, okay, will give you the answer to your money multiplier. Okay, and The simple money multiplier or the maximum money multiplier that you will deal with is simply as follows. Okay, it equals 1 divided by RR, and RR is the reserve ratio. Okay, so the 10% we're talking about. Now, so given the example just now, since we required, I mean, the reserve ratio was 10% in our example, then the money multiplier, the simple money multiplier is 1 divided by 10%, which is 10. That means Daisy's initial $100 deposit will eventually grow money supply by 10 times, which is $1,000. Okay, however, okay, in reality, two things can make your money multiplier smaller. One is excess reserves. That's when the banks hold more than what's required of them by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve requires 10%. Banks want to be safe and they hold 15%. Then the extra 5% is what we call excess reserves. Now this will lower money multiplier because when banks hold on to more money as reserves, that money is not being loaned out and coming back and loaned out and coming back to create new money with, right? So that makes how much money supply will grow smaller. Second is what we call cash drain. That's what people hold in cash outside of banks, right? In our example, we assume no cash is held outside of banks, but in reality, we know we all hold some cash. When you hold on to that cash in your wallet, it's not circulating, being loaned out and spent, so it's not creating new money, right? So a more complete formula for money multiplier is 1 minus cash drain divided by reserve ratio plus excess reserves. These are all measured in percentages. Okay, so given the example we just had, okay, your money multiplier for the simple money multiplier is 10, 1 divided by RR. Okay, but so that means the new deposit of $100 that Daisy made will increase money supply by the end by $1,000. However, if we assume there's a 10% cash drain, so 10% of all the money is held by people as cash, and banks hold excess reserves of 5%, so they hold 15% total, then the money multiplier can be 1 minus cash drain of 10% divided by required reserve of 10% plus excess reserve 5%, and that would give you 6. So if this is the case, Daisy's initial $100 deposit will increase money supply by $600. Okay. Now, for the purpose of this class, I will only expect you to remember and know how to calculate the simple money multiplier, the 1 divided by RR. It's good to know about the full formula, but I won't test you on it. Okay, so anyway, that concludes our lecture for Unit 8. I hope you have learned something, and if you have questions, again, please make sure you write that down, and we will talk about it, okay, a week from this coming Monday. Okay, all right, enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I will see you on Monday for the review.